You text Mike yesterday.
Good morning.
I hope everybody enjoyed their afternoon yesterday.
Yeah. Looks like you got home.
Me?
Yeah.
No, not yet.
Quite.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Looking forward, actually, to getting home. Very much so.
Yeah.
I think we dodged a bullet with, there was some kind of conflict on Thursday evening, the 22nd, where we had to move our public meeting, because that's going to be Game 7. And if we were in a public hearing during Game 7, it would have been very difficult to focus. So I think we lucked out. It looks like we have most of our team assembled, and I believe Vice Chair Watchman will be joining shortly.
Ryan, I am planning on trying to get to the Window Rock meeting in person.
Okay.
So I'll be at Window Rock, Sholo, and Payson, all three of those in person.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I actually think that in addition to, the information we're going to receive visually, driving and seeing and experiencing, I think only adds to understanding and connectedness. So I think that's fabulous.
Do we have a list yet of the meetings with who's?
Okay, let's wait. We'll do business during the public meeting.
Right. Good point.
I know you want to dive right in.
No, it's just, you're right. Yeah, good point.
I think so.
Yeah, we just want to wait. Vice Chair. Oh, Vice Chair
Yeah, I'm
Watson is here.
Good morning.
Good
Good morning. Val, do we have council? I see. We see mapping. I see all of my colleagues. If you just give me a go ahead that there's nobody missing.
We're waiting for our special guest speaker, Eric McGee. There he is. There he is. Okay. We're ready to go and we're live.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you, team. Once again, for your flexibility with convening when we need to and for the promptness. I think it's terrific. So we'll dive right in with agenda item number 1, call to order and roll call. 1A, call for quorum. It is 8:01 a.m. on July 20th. 2021. I call this meeting of the Independent Redistricting Commission to order. For the record, the Executive Assistant, Valerie Newman, will be taking roll. When your name is called, please indicate you are present. If you're unable to respond verbally, we ask that you please type your name. Val.
Vice Chair Watchman,
Present.
Commissioner Lerner,
Present.
Commissioner Meal,
Present.
Commissioner York,
Present.
Chairperson Newberg.
Present.
And for the record, we also have Executive Director Brian Schmidt. We've got Deputy Director Lori Van Haren, Public Information Officer Michelle Crank. On our legal team, we've got Brett Johnson from Snell and Wilmer, and we've got Roy Herrera and Jillian Andrews from Ballard Spar. Our mapping consultants, we have Mark Flahan from Timmins, Doug Johnson from NDC Research, Ivy Beller-Sikansky from NDC Research, and our special guest, Eric McGee, who's co-author of The Efficiency Gap, and he's on the board, he's one of the board members for planscore.org, and our transcriptionist, Angela Miller. That's everyone.
All right, thank you. Welcome, Eric, and thank you for all of that introduction, Val. Please note for the minutes that a quorum is present. We'll move to agenda item 1B, call for notice. Val, was the notice and agenda for the commission meeting properly posted 48 hours in advance of today's meeting?
Yes, it was, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. We'll move to agenda item 2, approval of minutes from July 19th, 2021. 2A, we just had a general session. Any feedback, comments, edits?
Madam Chair, the one thing I would add was to add Commissioner Watchman to the top, on the list of folks at the top, because since he did join a little later, it shows up later on, but he doesn't appear in the top list of attendees. I'm not sure. So.
Got it. Okay, if there's no further discussion, I'll entertain a motion to approve the general session minutes for July 19th, 2021.
This is Commissioner Lerner. I move to approve the minutes from July 19th, 2021.
I'll entertain a second.
Commissioner York, seconds.
Any further discussion? With that, we will do a vote. Vice Chair Watchman,
Aye.
Commissioner Meal,
Aye.
Commissioner Lerner,
Aye.
Commissioner York.
Aye.
With that, the minutes are approved with a 5-0 vote. Oh, did I vote? Chairwoman Newberg is an aye, and with that, it's a 5-0 vote on the approval of minutes. Thank you, Val, as always. With that, we will move to agenda item number 3, opportunity for public comments. Public comment will open for a minimum of 30 minutes and remain open until the adjournment of the meeting. Comments will only be accepted electronically in writing on the link provided in the notice and agenda for this public meeting and will be limited to 3,000 characters. Please note, members of the commission may not discuss items that are not specifically identified on the agenda. Therefore, pursuant to ARS 38-431.01H, action taken as a result of public comment will be limited to directing staff to study the matter, responding to any criticism, or scheduling the matter for further consideration and decision at a later date. With that, we will move to agenda item number 4, discussion on public comments received prior to today's meeting, basically comments we've received in the last 22 hours. I open it up to my fellow commissioners.
This is Commissioner Lerner. Just a couple of things. Again, thank you as always to the folks who are doing the commenting. Factoring in independence into our discussions about competitiveness was an interesting point, a good point. So it's just something for us to keep in mind, since we know Arizona has a lot of independents registered here, as was mentioned by our consultant yesterday. So I appreciate that. And then it was an interesting point. We did ask to add zip codes for people to sign in. And then somebody said, well, there's a million zip codes in a county. So good point on that. We'll just have to figure out how we work through that. That's all I have.
I still like zip codes. Keeps everybody local.
Me too.
One piece of data amongst many.
Exactly.
Any other comments? Yeah, I actually have nothing to add. I usually do, but I felt that many of the questions were answered in subsequent presentations in the agenda. And so if there is no further comment, we will move to agenda item number 5, which is update from the mapping consultant, Timmins NDC. Please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Good to see you 2 days in a row. The first start we'll mention is the listening tour survey. I know there was a comment about the zip codes that was just brought up. We did add zip codes to the listening tour survey, and that is now ready to go. Being that zip codes are a geographic feature, we can easily tie it to a county. So that's not a problem. We can get to the county if we need to, and probably an estimation of 90% of zip codes probably only span one county. I'm sure there's a couple that do span multiple counties, but we can figure out however to get that data to you guys if you wanted to see counties instead. That's not a problem. The only other update that we have from yesterday to today, except for the presentation you guys will see, is we're gearing up for the listening tour. So we're making final preparations on our side to make sure that we are successful going forward. And with that, that's all I got from my side. I'll turn it over to Doug.
Yeah. Do we want to introduce Dr. McGehee at this point, or is he on a later item?
Not yet.
Okay.
Oh, yes, that's going to be our next agenda item. So before we jump to that, let's close this.
Okay.
You have anything specific on what Mark just shared?
No, I think
Okay.
we
Excellent.
took most of yesterday. So.
You know what, I would just like to share and just thank you, Mark, that obviously our public comment system is working. I mean, you received public comment and within 24 hours, you've digested it, planned for it, accounting for it. And I just want to thank you and acknowledge that.
You're welcome.
And if there's no further conversation, we will now jump to agenda item number 6, presentation and discussion concerning potential competitive measurement tests. With that, Doug, please.
Yes, thank you. Today, we're honored to have Professor McGehee, who is the first of a number of academic experts in this field that have contacted to see if they're available and willing to talk with you about the issue of competitiveness. I do want to express my appreciation. I just called him on Thursday and emailed him on Friday, and he was willing to turn around and make a presentation to you this morning. Obviously, this has been prepared on short notice, so we will probably have him back as well as we get more information on this and get more into detail and into decision making. But he is, I do appreciate his willingness to turn around quickly. And as Valerie mentioned at the beginning, he is co-author of the efficiency gap measure that I mentioned yesterday, and he is on the board of an organization called PlanScore, which is set up a website where you can update maps or you submit maps and it generates a whole bunch of competitive scores. So he'll talk more about that. And just as a little bit of background, he is a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California, and he has his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. As I mentioned, he's the first of a number of experts that we will be having, so that their viewpoints and perspectives can essentially enrich your decision-making process as you consider this important issue. And with that, I will turn it over to him.
Thank you, Doug. And thank you to commissioners for having me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. As Doug said, this has been a quick turnaround, so I can't vouch for the quality of this presentation, but hopefully it'll be clear enough for all you guys. I've never actually used Google Meet before. Do I do present now to share slides? Okay.
Yeah.
All from a window. Okay, that
It's going to
looks
be a little
promising.
weird too. All the faces disappear, and all you'll see is your screen.
Right. Yeah, I'm familiar with that from Zoom. I'm just not not normally a Google Meet guy. Hold on, let me get this started, and then hopefully this will work here. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
All right. So
Yep.
as Doug mentioned, I'm so I have a day job, but I also am on the board of and one of the kind of members of the team behind this website called PlanScore, and I'm coming to you in that capacity today because I think PlanScore may have some tools that'll be useful to you, and also just to talk to you more generally about competitiveness and redistricting. That's what Doug asked me to talk about today. What I want to do is not necessarily, in the law that establishes the Arizona Commission, it mentions competitiveness, of course, but and some language about drawing a certain number of competitive districts. I'm not really here to tell you how many competitive districts you should draw, or how competitive your plan should be overall. But I do want to give you some sense of how you might think about the question of competitiveness and how to measure it. I think I have some recommendations along those lines. So again, won't be solving your problem, but hopefully we'll be able to shed some light on it, as it were. So first, I want to talk about kind of what competitiveness means, at least in the context of the Arizona Commission, how that then might be measured, what might be one approach to measuring it. There are actually a number of approaches, but I'm going to kind of suggest one that I think might be the most effective for you guys. I'm going to talk a little bit, hopefully without sinking too deep into the weeds, about how competitiveness relates to the concept of partisan bias or partisan advantage in redistricting, which is more kind of the classic gerrymandering question. And then kind of give you a little bit of a presentation, a demo of the PlanScore website, so you can get a sense of how it might help you with this question. All right, so what does competitive mean? Well, before we can talk about competitiveness is one dimension of sort of partisan outcomes or election outcomes in a redistricting plan. And I think that concept itself, so it's just the election outcomes themselves, can be broken into two really super broad categories. The first is partisanship or partisan considerations. That's where voters are supporting candidates as representatives of political parties. So they don't really care so much about the person's name. They care about the label that comes after that name. And so when they are evaluating, they might be somebody who's a really diehard party supporter. They're always going to vote for that party. They might be somebody who, decides one election to the next which party they're going to support, but they're always evaluating the candidates as members of that broader political party and how they perceive that party has performed. The other just really super broad category is personal characteristics. This is when you support a candidate as an individual. And the individual candidate record, either because of their personality or that's the cut of their jib or whatever it is, maybe it's just the fact that they take a sort of constellation of policy positions that makes them distinct from the typical member of their party. It's really that individual and that individual candidate record that matters, and that's what you're voting on as a voter. So Doug talked a little bit about this kind of personal versus partisan, I think, in his presentation yesterday. Personal is often considered synonymous with incumbency. But it's not exclusively the same thing. But incumbency certainly is one of these kind of personal factors that might play a role. So I think when we're talking about redistricting, the thing that matters most is the partisan and not the personal. And that's because the partisan is the thing that you guys have the most control over when you're drawing the lines. It doesn't mean that incumbency doesn't play a role or have some factor into some redistricting plan. Certainly, if a party is drawing a plan, they might try and design the districts to this particular district or that district to be represented by some particular person. They have a person in mind when they're drawing the district, right? So that is certainly a possibility. Hold on, I'm trying to plug in my computer here. Using more juice than I expected. So so you can certainly have that personal characteristic be part of redistricting, but I think you, as the Arizona Commission, my read of the law, and again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not here to advise you on the law, but my read of it and kind of how I'm going to be approaching this presentation today is on the assumption that you're actually really not allowed to consider that aspect of the line drawing. So the Arizona law specifically mentions party registration and voting history as something you can use to evaluate the competitiveness of districts, but not the residence of incumbents or candidates, right? So that suggests to me that really, beyond the fact that redistricting is mostly about sort of varying the partisan composition of these districts, in addition to that, that's really kind of your mandate is to consider those factors and not the personal factors. So when we talk about competitive and competitiveness, it's a kind of a partisan definition from my perspective. So it's that the district's partisanship makes it possible that it will be held by more than one party over its lifetime. That is the 10 years that district will exist. That doesn't mean that the personal part isn't there, but the personal part enters into the equation through a certain amount of extra uncertainty about how the election result is going to go. So it becomes kind of packaged into a general sense of, well, there might be something else going on, and our prediction about how this district is going to perform is going to be less than perfect as a result. It's not the only thing that contributes uncertainty. There's lots of things, but it is one of the things that contributes to that uncertainty, makes it a little bit larger. I will also note that over the last, say, 30, 40 years, the dominant trend has been for the personal factors to become much less important and the partisan factors to become much more important. So these days, it's pretty easy actually to compared to decades ago, to forecast how a race is going to go based on the partisan composition of the district, and without even knowing who the incumbent is. All right, so how might we measure competitiveness? Well, I think there's a number of different approaches we might take, and I'll list 3 of them here in ascending order of quality in my view. The first would be to use the party registration of the district. That's an option in Arizona. It's not an option in every state, but Arizona has party registration, so we could use party registration. It is an option you could use. You could take this route. I think of the options I'm going to present here, it's the worst. Why is it the worst? Well, because what matters is not the labels on a party registration, on a registration form, I'm a D or I'm an R or whatever. It's the votes. How does this person actually cast ballots for the race in question? That's what you are actually concerned about, not party registration. Party registration is a stand-in for these other things. And as I heard you mention at the outset, there's this question about what to do with the other category, the sort of independents, right? The reality is there's lots and lots of research that shows that independents are usually closet partisans. They're not usually the classic swing voters. Certainly there's a chunk of independents who are swing voters, but most independents are not. They tend to not only vote consistently up and down the ticket for one party, but they also vote consistently over time for that same party. So if they lean Democratic in one election, they'll lean Democratic in the next election, that kind of thing. So that makes allocating independence as a way of trying to gauge competitiveness problematic in my view. Another option is to take votes for statewide office, like president, US Senate, governor, and use that as a sort of stand-in for how you think the partisan outcome of the district might go. This is a better approach. It's a better approach because it gets closer to that concept of actual votes. And it's better because in this day and age, as I said, party considerations drive outcomes a lot more than they used to. So the predictive power of these statewide offices has gotten a lot better. But fundamentally, what matters is votes for the office the district is drawn for, right? So if it's state legislature, it's votes for state legislature. If it's Congress, it's votes for Congress. So what we really need to know is the relationship between those statewide offices and the office in question. I think the best approach is to come up with an expected vote. What do you think the vote is going to be in that particular district? And there are tools that allow us to do this pretty well. They basically involve taking statewide office races, which you can re-aggregate into the new districts once they're drawn, take those past outcomes, and then translate those into predicted party performance based on how those things have related to each other in the past. So this is not a perfect method, but it requires, in my view, the fewest assumptions, and it's the most data-driven. Now, if we're going to do this, I think there are two very broad approaches that you might take. One is to just use the average election, and the other is to sort of factor in partisan tides. So what if we use just the average election? This is sort of, okay, we know what this relationship is, and we know what it has been kind of over the last 10 years, say. We use that to say, okay, what on average over the last 10 years, how would a district like this have performed if it had existed in the last 10 years? And then for this, you would just kind of pick, you sort of predict the party performance in each of the districts, and then you'd pick some range of the two-party vote that seemed competitive. So say like, okay, any seat where the winner won by less than 55%, say, we'll consider that competitive. You can also, for this kind of calculation, factor in the uncertainty about that expected outcome. So one of the nice things about this methodology is that you have that relationship between the statewide vote and the vote for Congress or state legislature. And you can see how much error there was in that forecast in the past. So you can say, okay, yeah, on average, there was this relationship, but there's a lot of outcomes that don't fit that relationship perfectly. How many outcomes were there like that? How far off from that kind of main tendency were the results? And then you can use that to have best guesses about the amount of error or uncertainty in your prediction. So you can also factor that into your decision. And even better, in my view, and sort of the complete approach for the kind of thing that you're doing, is to have that kind of average outcome, and then imagine what a partisan tide might do to it. So a partisan tide being an election where it seems pretty clear that candidates of one party did better across the board and candidates of the other party did worse. So I'm thinking, imagine a year like 2010 for Republicans or 2018 for Democrats. All Republicans did better pretty much in 2010. All Democrats did better pretty much in 2018. So what you can kind of look back over the history of Arizona over the last 10 years and say, okay, what's been the sort of typical partisan tide, or what's the partisan tide we want to kind of imagine is the largest we would potentially see? And will any given district flip party hands under those conditions? So if you had a district that was 55% Democratic by your prediction, and you said, oh, I think the largest tide we might see would be 6-point shift, then that seat could flip. And you could say, okay, maybe we'll consider that competitive because it has the potential with this sort of shifting up and down, this natural shifting up and down that we have seen over time. It's likely to actually flip. And so it could be a competitive seat for that reason. So how does competitiveness relate to bias, to partisan advantage? This is a little bit more of a complicated conversation. And so, like I said, I hope I don't get too much into the weeds and can keep it kind of high level. But I'm done trying to give you sort of a primer on this relationship, because they're not exactly the same thing, but they do relate to each other. So bias or partisan advantage in redistricting is largely about the concept of efficiency. What is efficiency? Well, efficiency is where the vote that you cast in a particular race has the best chance of producing a winner. So if you got a district that's like 60-40 Democratic, the 40% Republicans in that district, in a sense, their votes are not efficient, because for Republican wins, because they're all cast for a loser. They're cast for the Republican candidate in that seat. If you were a gerrymanderer, you would say, hey, that's not good. What I would prefer is to move some of those people into a neighboring district where they have a better chance of actually producing a win. And so and the same thing is true for a seat where, like, say it's 80-20 Republican. Those extra Republican votes beyond the number necessary to win the seat are inefficiently allocated. They could be moved to another seat. So the party that a party wins more seats as it allocates its voters more efficiently. So that is, as it has more seats that it wins by small margins compared to the opposition, who wins their seats, if they win any at all, by very large margins. So those large margin districts are kind of, you're sort of dumping supporters into a small number of districts where a lot of their votes are inefficient. And all measures of partisan advantage, in one respect or another, capture this notion of efficiency. They do differ from each other. They can, under some circumstances, give different results, but they all, somewhere in them, is a kernel of this concept of efficiency. And I will say, for Arizona, for reasons I can get into in the Q&A if you want, for Arizona, they all give very broadly similar results. So you actually, the good news for Arizona is, if you were worried about this gerrymandering question at all, you wouldn't really have to worry too much about the metric that you chose, because they're all going to kind of give you the same result. So how does this relate to competitiveness? Well, there's one way I think that is important where it could relate to competitiveness. Generally speaking, I wouldn't worry too much about the gerrymandering side when you're thinking about competitiveness. But again, I can see a way in which they could be problematically linked. If you felt, because of other criteria that the commission is required to follow, if you felt that you needed to create some uncompetitive districts, you can think of those uncompetitive districts as sort of using up partisans of one side. If it's an uncompetitive Republican seat, you've sort of dumped a bunch of Republicans into a small number of districts. Same thing on the Democratic side. And that means if you create those uncompetitive districts, and then you turn to the rest of the state, and your goal is to create only competitive seats in the rest of the state, it'll be easier to create competitive seats for the other side, because you've used up a bunch of partisans in those uncompetitive seats to start. And if you end up having a small number of uncompetitive seats that are won by one party, and then the rest are competitive seats won by the other party, that's a gerrymander, at least on paper. That is exactly the classic formula for a partisan gerrymander. And it would be completely accidental in your case. So I think that's where you have to be a little careful. And so so just give you an example of this, or a little toy example. We've got 50 voters, 30 are red, 20 are blue. And we draw these districts around those voters. Oops, look, we've got 5 districts And despite the fact that the state is 30 red, 20 blue, we have 3 blue and 2 red. And it's purely based on how the district lines were drawn. This looks a lot like the scenario that I just described. Because look, we've got a couple of seats that we've drawn that are overwhelmingly red, have almost no blue voters at all. And so that could be kind of these initial uncompetitive seats that you draw for based on other criteria. And then the remaining are just very narrowly blue, but they're blue enough that they're going to be blue seats. And that's how you end up with this distorted outcome. So what's kind of the best solution to this? I think in very broad terms, to avoid this kind of bias, it's probably best to try and balance competitiveness in some very rough sense. It doesn't have to be perfect, but if you've got some uncompetitive seats on one side, something that's roughly uncompetitive on the other side is going to help prevent this kind of scenario from happening. Again, they don't have to be, if it's 80-20 Democratic, it doesn't have to be 80-20 Republican, but just kind of seats that are also uncompetitive on that other side would help alleviate this particular issue. All right. How might Plan Score help? So Plan Score is a collection of 5 geniuses and me. It is a nonpartisan redistricting resource whose goal is to help people predict the partisan outcomes of their plans. So it will give you the expected partisan vote in each district. In your new plan, it will also calculate a variety of the partisan advantage metrics that are out there, including the efficiency gap, but also the ones that others have created. And it has a big database that has these bias metrics going way back in time, back to the 1970s for some states. It's a great collection of people who are behind this, but the real amazing person, I've set him off to the side over here, is Mike McGursky, who did all of the coding for the website, who has designed it, made it all work. He is an absolute wizard when it comes to this geospatial stuff. So I've created some screenshots of Plan Score, but I think what I'd like to do is go to the actual website and show you it working dynamically. So let's see if I can make that work. Oh, a tab. I can do a tab. That's great. All right, can everybody see that? I hope so. I can't see you now.
Yes, we can.
Okay,
All
great.
good.
All right. Okay, great. All right, so this is the main Plan Score site. When you go there, it's www.planscore.org. It takes you to a map of the country with the historical metrics. So U.S. House, State Senate, state houses. We don't have this historical metrics for every single state, but we have them for a lot of states. Generally more for state legislatures. Mostly because when you get in the U.S. House, smaller states, sometimes the metrics can, if you have like a state with 3 seats, partisan gerrymandering is not as much of an issue, and it tends to become harder to measure. But so those are the historical. If you wanted that tends to be popular with the media because they write stories about the history of gerrymandering. But then you can go up here to the top, do Score Plan. And then it takes you to this site that with this big fat button that says select a file to upload. It will take any of these types of files and it'll just automatically detect what kind of file you're uploading. So what I did was I went to the website for Arizona's last commission where they helpfully had the shape files for the for the last plan, and I downloaded it, and then I just select it on my desktop, and it uploads it. So we'll give that a second to go. Usually takes a couple minutes. All right, so there's Arizona's congressional districts as they exist now. Now we can go down, the next step is we can go down and we can actually tell Plan Score whether we think a Republican or a Democrat is going to represent that seat. That's going to help with the prediction because as Doug mentioned in his presentation yesterday, incumbency still is a factor. It's not the factor that it once was, but it is still a factor. And so you're going to get a better, more accurate prediction if you factor in incumbency. Again, my sense is that you are not allowed to factor in incumbency in this way, but if you wanted to, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to tell you that you can't, but I'm going to leave this all as though every seat is open for the purposes of this exercise, under the assumption that that's what you guys would have to do too. And then you just hit score this plan. And this part takes just a little bit longer, but not too long, especially for a smaller plan like this.
While we're waiting for this to upload, I just, I was remiss in sharing with my colleagues that after this, we have the opportunity for Q&A, but we also have the opportunity to go into executive session for the purpose of obtaining legal advice with respect to the competitive measurement test. So as you're taking notes with your questions, please remember that you could have two different buckets. So with that, please continue.
Great, thank you. So you see it has finished its work. As I suggested, you look at the different measures of partisan advantage, and they all look broadly similar. Each of these shows not just where this plan is, but also the distribution of plans around the country on this same metric. It also tells you, in terms of the uncertainty in our prediction, how likely it is that the plan will favor one side, and all of these are 52%, 61, 61, just a very slight tilt, right? Not very much. That's pretty close to a coin toss, right? Which is kind of what you would hope to see on these metrics if there isn't any advantage, right? Any bias. It also, for one of the metrics in particular, the efficiency gap, it does this kind of partisan tides test, and it shifts things up and down to see how the advantage metric changes as a result. So how sensitive is the result to that advantage metric swinging around? And then down at the bottom, and this is the part I think that might be of greatest interest for the commissioners and for the commission, is it gives you the specific prediction for each race, along with the chance of a Democratic win. Now this is akin to the average election result that I was talking about before, but without the partisan tide part built in. So we've got in an average election year over the last 10 years, this is how each of those seats would turn out. And then this chance of a Democratic win reflects the uncertainty in our measure. So that number is going to get, if it's like here, we've got a seat that's predicted to be 50-50. And so the chance of a Democratic win is pretty slim, right? It's basically a coin toss. But then you get down to like a 61-39 seat, and then it's overwhelmingly the chance that it's going to be a Democratic seat, and then you have the same thing on the Republican side in some cases. So it gives some sense. It also tells you some of the inputs that went into this, like the presidential vote, and it also has some demographic metrics. And then it notes that all of these are simulated as if they would be open seats. And then the map is colored to show kind of the general tendencies. The solid colors are solidly one way or the other, and then the shaded are ones that are a little sort of dicier in terms of which way they would go. And that would be kind of one sense of competitive or uncompetitive, right? But again, I think it might make more sense to take these predicted vote shares and acknowledge the fact that elections shift up and down, and then pick some number that seems reasonable in terms of how much shifting up and down you expect to happen, and to get a better sense of which ones might actually flip. All right. Now the question is, stop sharing. There we go. All right. Now I'm back with you guys. And so I'm going to go back to one more thing to show you. So I had created these just in case it all blew up on me. So this shows you, I thought it'd be useful to compare this plan score prediction to the actual 2020 vote. Turns out the 2020 election was a pretty average election, like relative to the history of Arizona over the last 10 years. And so you can see this open seat prediction that I just showed you compares to the actual 2020 vote quite well in each case. It's a very close match. Not perfect, but pretty close. If you run plan score with incumbency, you get even closer, right? Some of these are really pretty dead on. There's only one seat where it's a little bit off. And so you can see that incumbency does matter. It is changing the results a few percentage points, but it's not the force that it once was. Back in, say, the late 1980s, you would expect incumbency to maybe shift the vote by 10 points sometimes. It doesn't do that anymore, but it does nudge it a few percentage points. So you're going to get a more accurate prediction if you use incumbency. But you can get in the right ballpark without it. All right, so that's the presentation I've got for today. It gives you some sense of kind of how I would think about this question, and then like how you might use a tool like PlanScore. I will say PlanScore is free, and we're nonpartisan. We let anybody use it. We don't keep track of who uses it, so you can go and upload files and plans to your heart's content, and nobody will know. We won't know. We don't keep any record. So play around with it if you like. It's all automated. We don't need to be involved at all. So it's just provided there as a public service. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Cheryl, just a couple final thoughts on this. Again, thanks to Eric for presenting this on very short notice. So we really appreciate him putting together what I think was very useful presentation. One other thing that he and I did discuss is that some people may have heard of this Dave's Redistricting app. It's an online kind of simple redistricting tool, and they have merged the plan score calculations into that. So one of the things we'll follow up with him on is it possible to actually build the scoring into our redistricting tool as Dave's has? I have no idea whether that would be possible or resource appropriate, but we'll follow up on that just so you have it in the range of options on your table when you do get to the point of choosing metrics.
Yeah, so we are, like as Doug says, we're embedded into Dave's Redistricting app, and I think we're potentially open to other similar collaborations, but I can't speak for the whole PlanScore organization. So
yeah, we'll follow up on that so that when it does come time for the commission to make a decision, we can tell you whether or not we think we'll be able to incorporate it so it's live, or whether, as you saw, worst case, it's very quick to upload a shapefile and give you a report. So thank you again.
you're welcome.
Thank you both. Again, just reminding my colleagues, if there are questions that you've noted for executive session, let's earmark 2 buckets. And before we turn it over to Q&A, Doug, I don't know if you want to set any, additional context for how it would be helpful for us to be digesting this information or thinking about it, relative to future presentations. But if not, we can certainly dive right in.
Yeah, no, I think, whatever questions you have would be great to ask him. I do realize, this is a ton of information you've gotten in the last 24 hours. So I did talk already with Eric about him coming back kind of when you've had more time to process, and I've heard other viewpoints or other ideas as well, so that you can keep it all in context. So whatever questions you have from him today, great. This will not be your last chance to ask questions.
Okay. Commissioners.
I have a question for Doug, and I do appreciate the presentation, Eric. It's like when we look at the Constitution and it lists 6 factors, and now we've had several discussions about how we measure competitiveness. How do we measure the other factors? How do we measure compactness and some of the other factors? And will we be hearing anything on those?
So, yes, definitely hearing about those. Those are less complicated. I think the one that comes kind of close in oddity, I guess, would be because of the compactness world, because there are a whole bunch of different definitions of compactness. Like competitiveness, they often conflict too. So we'll get more into that. But this is I put so much emphasis on this one because competitiveness seems simple when you first hear about it. But in reality, measuring it and implementing it in a plan is very, as you're hearing, very complicated. So this is the one that will take a lot of thinking and a lot of discretion by the commission. The others are certainly just as important. We're not saying this should dominate or making any judgment calls on that front, but tend to be more straightforward. Like how many cities are split. That's a pretty straightforward concept. So we will be covering those, but not to the degree we're covering these.
This is Commissioner Lerner. So when you're looking at, first of all, thank you for your presentation. Very interesting about that. I learned a lot. Question, you're using existing lines, right? The existing districts right now, because that's what you have for data. How would you incorporate a plan score into, as we're working on redistricting and we may have to move lines that exist one way or the other, how does plan score work with lines that are not set in stone already?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I used the existing maps because it was easy to get a shapefile for those to get what the upload part of plan score is all about. The lines, the data behind all the calculations, those data they already exist at plan score, and so all we need from your side of it is the lines. And so I was just using those lines to just give some sense of how the website works. You can upload any lines you want. The only thing that we require is that it be an entire plan. So you have to draw all the districts and then upload the whole plan all together. You can't upload just sort of one district or 2 districts. You would need to get the whole thing in there. But if it is a complete map, you can upload it, and it doesn't even have to be a legal map or anything along those lines. It just could be any map that you have drawn and you just want to test and see what it looks like. You can upload it to plan score.
Eric, what is the base of the data? Is it the American Community Survey data, or what is your data based on?
So we have a big data set of all the election outcomes we actually have a data set of all the election outcomes going back to the 1970s. For the sake of Plan Score, we only used the last decade of data because we wanted everything to be as sort of close as possible to current times. And then I don't want to get too much into the methodological weeds, but there's this technique called regression analysis, and we used regression analysis on those that big data set. So the data set consisted of the actual election outcomes. It also had the presidential vote in each district, and it had whether that person was an incumbent or not. Whether it was open or Republican incumbent, Democratic incumbent. And then we can use that to see sort of how those things all relate to each other over the last 10 years. One of the nice things about the way that we did this is our process allows for a special estimate of the relationship for Arizona. So when we're producing those Arizona results, we're not using some kind of average relationship for the whole country. We're using the Arizona relationship and predicting for Arizona. And we can do that for all the states around the country. But we don't need, so the American Community Survey has demographic information, and we did not use demographic information for our model, for our predictions. It actually, I mean, we considered it, we tested some approaches that used it. It just doesn't turn out that it gives you all that much extra juice for your prediction. So we want to keep things clean and simple. So the things that are driving our results are the presidential vote and incumbency, and also what state and what election year you're talking about. So we allow it to kind of vary by election year as well. So we could give you a special prediction just for a particular, as if you were rerunning an election year again. But we decided that the better approach would be to sort of show the average for the decade. That's just a judgment call by us about what we wanted to present. But you could, given the underlying the nuts and bolts, you could provide a prediction for a specific election year as well. Does that answer your question?
It does, and it seems like how predictive will this then be of the next decade as opposed to looking backwards over the past decade, especially given that we're seeing some fairly significant shifting of voter preferences, across the country, sort of a realignment that is taking place. So how much can we count on the predictability of this given the state of the current political environment?
And I would add to that, because it's directly relevant, immigration. I mean, people coming to Arizona, we're an attractive state. So how that might, throw all of these results off. Thank you.
Yeah. So the United States is a dynamic country, and election results can definitely change, and they can change in unexpected ways. What's the line? Prediction is always difficult, especially about the future. It's nothing is perfect. I will say, a couple thoughts. One is, these days the predictive ability is actually better than in part because of the role of partisanship in American political life. It has made the predictability of elections better. It's not perfect, but it is better. And I mean, as you saw, the results that Plan Score spat out matched up with the 2020 election really quite well. And then the other thing is, because of your mandate, which is to try and draw districts that are going to be competitive, you have no choice but to try and predict the future, because you are drawing lines for the future, and you've been asked by the law to anticipate which seats you think would be competitive. And so given that reality, it's the best thing to do is to predict the best that you can. And I think that this does offer the best predictions that are possible. Again, not perfect, but pretty accurate these days, and kind of given the reality of what your mandate is, I think you probably have no choice but to do some guessing.
If I can ask a follow-up then on that, you used the presidential race. Obviously, that's every 4 years. But I've heard that it's actually better to use, or good, I don't know if it's better, I don't know, but good to use statewide races that might be better predictors for us in Arizona versus what's happening on the national front. Also because people come out for a presidential race, but then they don't come out 2 years later for the other races. And in Arizona, we are on that different cycle, right? So we have our statewide races not when the presidential happens. So how would you, or what might you recommend if you were to look just at Arizona and use statewide races to try to give you some of that prediction that you've done? Because you did well with the alignment on president, but things can happen, right? And personalities can come into play. All sorts of things come into play with that. Would you look at any of our statewide races and see if you could, and how could we maybe test your model by using maybe other statewide races that we have?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a number of reasons why we didn't use other statewide races. We did test using other statewide races. Generally speaking, when you try to improve the prediction with other statewide races, it doesn't add much beyond the presidential contest. So the presidential contest, even in off years, drives most of these down ballot contests in terms of the predictive ability. So you could certainly look at what the gubernatorial or the U.S. Senate race did, but it's not necessarily going to add much beyond what the presidential vote gets you. Because what we're looking for, the thing that's going to create the most problems for something like Plan Score is where the rank order of the districts gets all messed up. So races can sort of shift one direction or another from one year to the next, but they also kind of scramble net relative to each other to a certain extent, right? This seat was the most Republican last year, and now it's not anymore, right? That kind of thing happens. That's the piece that is hardest for Plan Score to manage. The reality is that rank ordering gets scrambled a lot less than it used to. And races like governor in particular is one of those contests around the country that often is unpredictable. You'll have somebody, the governor of Louisiana is a Democrat. The governor of Massachusetts is a Republican, right? There is unexpected things happen in gubernatorial races. Those unexpected things in gubernatorial races, if you look at the outcomes district by district, it can produce a lot of that scrambling around. You know, this district no longer looks like it's quite so democratic because of this gubernatorial race, say. But when you compare that to how the down ballot races actually went, they don't tend to reflect that scrambling to the same extent. Like U.S. House, state legislature are more predictable, and that rank ordering is more consistent over time than would appear by looking at some of those top of the ticket races. And maybe the best way to think about it is just because you have a statewide race doesn't necessarily mean that it's telling you anything about those down ballot races, right? Imagine if somebody ran for, the statewide office of motherhood and apple pie, and they happened to win by an overwhelming margin because they were really good on those two issues. And people really like that candidate and they voted for that person. But then when they turn to state legislature or U.S. Congress, they're like, yeah, but that race doesn't really, that's a totally different decision that I'm making over there. It doesn't have anything to do with this decision over here. And so in theory, those other statewide races could tell you something more about the down ballot races. Just in practice, they don't. And we can capture most of the additional variation through our modeling, allowing this relationship between the presidential vote and these down ballot races. We allow that to vary by year and by state. So we have this special relationship just for Arizona. We have a relationship that is different for each election year. So we're capturing some of that variation over time in the way that we handle the modeling. The final reason why we didn't take the approach you're describing is that it made it a lot more complicated to put the website together, because some states don't have a U.S. Senate race in any given election, right? Sometimes it's hard to get the results at the level of detail we need to do our modeling with some of these other races. So it allowed us to incorporate a lot more states and do a lot more predictions for a lot more states without really any cost to the accuracy of our predictions.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you so much. That was incredibly informative, and we look forward to additional learning on competitive measurement tests.
For sure.
With that, I'm actually going to use our discretion to move agenda items. Vice Chair Watchman, I believe, is with us for another 30 minutes. And our agenda item number 10, I think, is a significant item. So we'll move to agenda item number 10, discussion concerning a summary of recent litigation related to the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee. And I would like to suggest again to the commission, like most of our legal briefings, I suggest we have our legal briefing in public session, and that we elect to go into executive session. I know I personally have some questions in order to understand the application of this to our unique needs. And so I'd like to just, for public record, say the commission may vote to go into executive session, which will not be open to the public, for the purpose of obtaining legal advice to further implement and or advance these legal issues pursuant to ARS 38-431.03A3. And with that, I will turn it over, I believe, to Roy. Oh, and by the way, should we take a 3-minute break? Does anybody want just a few minutes before we dive in? Okay, Roy.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think the purpose of this agenda item is to provide a brief overview of the Brnovich case, which many of you have seen in the news, was decided a couple weeks ago by the United States Supreme Court. Of course, as the chairwoman indicated, if there are questions related to the application of this case, specifically to redistricting or potential claims that will be brought against this commission, we would ask to address those in executive session. But for our purposes here, I just want to go over the case, the holding in the case, and sort of what it means for Section 2 vote denial claims. And then, like I said, if there are questions related specifically to what the case said or did, I can answer them now or in executive session as they apply to redistricting. So I'll just start by, again, and this may be something that you guys are familiar with already, but sort of discussing what the case was about. Ultimately, what the case concerned was two different Arizona policies, election procedures that we have in the state that were challenged under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The first was Arizona's policy of rejecting election day ballots cast out of precinct. So this was generally referred to as the out of precinct policy. The second is Arizona's prohibition on ballot collection, which is the sort of more contentious, I would say, of the two policies that were in question here. But as I mentioned, the plaintiffs challenged both of these policies as violating Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. During our Voting Rights Act training, I made the distinction that under Section 2, we generally see two different types of challenges. The first are vote denial claims, and then the second are vote dilution claims. It is the latter, the vote dilution claims, that we typically see during the redistricting process. That is not what this case was. This was a vote denial challenge, a vote denial claim, and such that it is different and distinct, I think, from the type of claims you would typically see in the redistricting context. But again, we can talk about its application a bit later. Ultimately, what happened here was that the court did not side with the plaintiffs. It ultimately sided with Attorney General Brnovich in a 6-3 vote. The majority opinion was authored by Justice Alito and the minority opinion by Justice Kagan. Now, one of the reasons why this case was important, well, I would say there's maybe two reasons. The first is that, of course, this was the first voting rights case that we've seen under the new court's constitution, meaning we have new justices on the Supreme Court. Obviously, as we all know, the court is deemed to be more conservative leaning given the Republican presidential nominations on the court over the last several years. So it was the first time we saw how this court would view a voting rights case. So that's one reason why it was particularly important. I think the second reason, too, is because it was a vote denial case, and because the court had not yet, before this case, established a clear standard or test for vote denial cases. I think, a lot of folks, a lot of parties, in particular, a lot of amici that came in and proposed different standards to the court were very interested in the kind of standard that the court would adopt. And in particular, there were parties that, for example, encouraged the court to adopt the kind of standard we see in a vote dilution case. And, during our Voting Rights Act training, I think we mentioned very clearly the Jingles test, which is obviously a 2-part test, which is first begins with a 3-part test and then goes into a totality of the circumstances test. There were some folks that encouraged the court to adopt that kind of test in a vote denial context. Now, notably, that is not what the court decided to do. The court instead distinguished the kind of challenge that occurred in this case as a time, place, or manner restriction, the type of policies, I should say, that were challenged in this case, as a time, place, or manner restriction that was distinct from a vote dilution claim. And then the court went on essentially to look at a number of factors that it considered, in order to establish whether there was a vote denial violation under Section 2. Now, I think what's important, and this is a general caveat I maybe should have started with, is that there's been, a lot of analysis as to the meaning of this case, even in a vote denial context. I mean, I recently saw even this week several election scholars doing some pretty exhaustive opinion pieces on the meaning of this case and whether the factors, and I'll list them momentarily, that the case that the court considered here are essentially going to be the test going forward for vote denial claims. The court indicated in its majority opinion that the factors that considered were non-exhaustive. So potentially there could be other things that the court considers. But I think, again, as election lawyers and prognosticators, we're all looking at these particular factors on whether that is how we judge vote denial cases going forward. And I'll just talk about the factors very, briefly and list them for you. So basically, the court listed 5 different factors, again, in a time, place, or manner case, which the court deemed this one to be. The first was the size of the burden imposed by the challenged voting rule. And in particular, the court noted, and I think this is a quote that will be used in future vote denial cases, that the mere inconvenience to the voter cannot be enough to demonstrate a violation of Section 2. So again, this factor sort of looks at the size of the burden imposed. The second is the degree to which the voting rule departs from what constituted a widespread election practice in 1982. 1982, of course, was when the VRA was amended. And so the court looked back to 1982 and again, as a factor, listed whether, again, the election procedure in question departs from a widespread practice back then when the VRA was amended. The third is the size of the disparity in the rule's impact on different racial groups. So again, looking at the disparity between the racial groups that were alleged to have been discriminated against under Section 2, that size of disparity is important to the court. That's what the court indicated, at least. The voting opportunities, this is the fourth factor, voting opportunities provided by the state's entire voting system. So again, what kind of voting opportunities does the state provide as a whole? Does it provide early voting, for example, mail-in voting, that kind of thing? And then the fifth factor that the court listed was the strength of the state's interest served by the challenged voting rule. And in particular, in this case, the court focused on avoiding voter fraud as a main state interest related to these particular election procedures in question. So just to get to the holding of the case, as I mentioned, the court did not find that the two policies violated Section 2 as alleged by the plaintiffs. And in applying this test, if you want to call it that, at least applying the 5 factors, first, with the out-of-precinct policy, the court found that the out-of-precinct policy posed only a modest burden on voters, in that the racial disparity of the impact was small. And so that was, of course, an important factor in doing this analysis. Further, the court noted that precinct-based voting served a legitimate state interest in keeping wait times low. These are wait times at voting locations, and ensuring orderly election administration. So again, looking at the 5 factors, the court found that this out-of-precinct policy that was challenged was not a violation of Section 2. Now, turning to as I mentioned, I think the more contentious piece, which is the ballot collection prohibition in Arizona. The court found, again, applying these factors, that personally returning or dropping off an early ballot is part of the normal burden associated with voting, and potential burdens on voters who must travel great distances are mitigated by Arizona's long early voting period. So again, one of the factors, as I mentioned, was sort of the entirety of the state's voting system. Here in particular, the court noted that Arizona had a long early voting period, and therefore this prohibition was not a sort of an undue burden, if you will. The court found that the challengers, and again, this is related to ballot collection prohibition, found that the challengers offered no statistical evidence of disparate impact in this case, and relied only on testimony as to the impact. And then finally, I'll just note that the court noted here that the state's interest in preventing fraud would have been great enough to overcome even a showing of disparate impact. And again, this is the court saying this, as mail-in voting is more susceptible to fraud and intimidation than in-person voting. So to sort of summarize here, it appears we may have a new test for vote denial cases that are based on these 5 factors that the court's listed. Again, the caveat is we haven't seen this case applied yet in a vote denial case, and so it's a bit a little unclear to see sort of how courts will apply the 5-factor test going forward, and whether that is the standard going forward for vote denial cases. But that is ultimately what happened, and of course, the challenge failed, and these 2 particular Arizona policies will continue to be in place. So I will end there with a sort of overview of the case itself and answer any questions related to that. And of course, if there are questions that would be more appropriate in executive session, we can take them then.
Thank you, Roy. Questions on the academic information we just heard? If there are no academic questions, and that was so informative, I will entertain a motion to go into executive session to discuss for the purpose of obtaining legal advice to further implement and/or advance these legal issues. Do I have a motion?
This is Commissioner Lerner. I so move.
Do I have a second?
I'll second. Vice Chair Watchman.
Any further discussion? With that, a vote. Vice Chair Watchman.
Aye.
Commissioner Meal.
Aye.
Commissioner Lerner.
Aye.
Commissioner York.
Aye.
Commissioner Newberg is an aye. With that, with a 5-0 vote, we will move into executive session. We will give a full update to the public with what is discussed. And if anybody needs a couple-minute break, we'll see you soon. Thank you. Okay, I think we have our entire team. Am I correct, Director Schmidt or Val?
Yep.
Okay, awesome.
We're less Vice Chair Watchman also.
Yes. Welcome back, everybody, team, staff. Thank you for, understanding the time we spent in executive session. Just to alert the public, Vice Chair Watchman had a hard stop at 9:30, which we had alluded to earlier. So we appreciate him making the effort to join us for the first hour and a half. I want to thank our counsel as well. We had the opportunity to discuss this case and its application to our responsibility with redistricting. And I'd say in particular, as it relates to our responsibility to, respect the VRA, particularly Section 2. And with that, I imagine, over time, it may be a conversation that we'll continue to have, but it's very new and there's more questions than answers. And so unless there's any other feedback on that agenda item, we can move back to agenda item number 7, which is the Executive Director's report and discussion thereof. Item A, discussion and possible action on community outreach coordinator. With that, Brian.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am hopeful to have a recommendation for you all next week for outreach. They're just, when trying to get all the details of the tour hammered out, we would like the outreach person on board as quickly as possible, but we have to make sure we're good to go on that end. So hopefully next week I have a candidate to recommend to you all. That's all I have for that item.
Brian, I just have one very quick question about, I don't personally feel that the lack of having this hire has impeded our listening tour. I mean, do you feel that in any way there have been, tasks that haven't been, fulfilled, or any challenge on that front?
Not at all, especially on this first tour that we're doing. We have 2 more, so we'll continue building as the process moves along. But our whole team is running as efficiently as possible and doing everything we can to make sure people are aware of the meetings. So we'll only add over time.
Okay.
Can I just ask a follow-up, Brian? And this may or may not. You just said that we have 2 more public meeting hearings. I guess I thought we had 1 more after this. I was unclear. Can you clarify?
Absolutely. So on the timeline yesterday, when we had the 2 review periods, one with the grid map and then one with the draft maps, in Timmins NDC's proposal, they also proposed going out and doing 8 public meetings during those 2 periods. So it's just our first of 3.
This is Commissioner Mule. I think we should think about getting feedback on the grid maps by every means other than necessarily doing tours, and then save the tours for when we have the draft maps, when it's really going to get intense and we're going to have a lot of feedback. But that's just one person's thought.
Yeah, but I think we should talk about this more as well, Commissioner. I mean, I tend to agree with Commissioner Mule. I'm not really sure about that extra one, so that might be worth discussion at some point.
This is Commissioner York. I mean, maybe we make this conversation a little bit further along after we've done a couple meetings to the public and see how those go. before we kind of draw some conclusions.
I was going to suggest that we add this as a future agenda item.
So I don't think the past commissions did 3 rounds of tours. I think each of the 2 did 2 rounds of tours was my understanding. But Brian, if you could just look into that and report back on that, I would appreciate it.
Yes, I absolutely will. I think part of that was that they had the data so early, so they were able to have the draft maps, but I'll look back at the specifics and get that to you all.
If Commissioner Meal, if you want, I can give you my understanding of what happened last time.
That'd be great.
Okay, so so you have and Doug Johnson can jump in here too. So you have the grid map, you flip a coin, you figure out which way it's going to go, right? So you have the grid map. From that grid map, it allows all of the stakeholders to come in and provide their maps, and of course, exactly what you said, they could do that electronically or through other means. But in many cases, the various stakeholders want to come in and explain how that map is worked and work with your map person. That then helps you inform how to move the lines from there based off of the grid map. If you wait until you have your maps complete, you're not able to really fully take into that integration, those stakeholders, maps itself, and that discussion. So quite honestly, the grid map, although 23 days, and I think that's completely appropriate, that's going to be a pivotal time where people are putting all of the information before you're basically making the decision. I'll give you an example. So the Navajo Nation came into the commission the last time in IRC 2.0, and Commissioner Freeman at the time utilized the Navajo map as one of the basis for basically one of his what if maps that went all the way forward. If you waited until the public period once the maps were chosen, you would have missed that opportunity to fully understand why the Navajo Nation believed how they worked in it from the grid map itself. So I just throw that in for context as to how it happened last time, and then the public period was really spent on minutia.
And I guess what I was suggesting is that obviously that 23-day period, we'd want every bit of input we could get, but I don't know that we need to go out and do a series of public meetings around the state. That's really the question.
Understood.
It sounds like we're going to have subsequent conversation about this, which is appropriate.
At that time, then can we also talk about just how the grid map, because this was interesting to hear. Thank you for that information about the Navajo Nation map. Because my understanding is the grid map will fluctuate. It will, we may adopt one version, but it's going to change and shift as we move. So can that be part of the discussion as well?
And I'll defer to, I don't know if Doug Johnson's still on this call.
Yeah.
Okay. But the grid map, it changes as part of going into the official maps. Once you've chosen a grid map, we stop calling it a grid map. It's because now you're changing it for purposes of the different criteria. So only one grid map. Just want to make sure we're clear on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's 3 official maps designated by the constitutional language: the grid map, the draft map, and your final map. But yes, as I think has been said fairly accurately, once you adopt the grid map, we're calling it the proposal is a listening tour about the grid map. But in reality, from day one of whether it's a public comment period or a tour, day one, you're going to get proposed draft maps. So people will immediately start revising that, and they'll be submitting what they recommend you adopt as draft maps, and not, all the changes in the maps have to be done in the context of changes to the grid, but they'll be proposing draft maps. Hopefully it helps.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Director Schmidt. Thank you, commissioners, for your questions. With that, we will move to agenda item number 8, discussion and possible action on proposed revised travel schedule. Anything, Brian?
Not that much new between yesterday and today. We're still trying to confirm a couple of the satellite locations in northern and southern Arizona. So as soon as we have those, we'll keep the website and press release updated. But that's really all I have for now.
Okay, thank you so much. And next week when we reconvene, we'll have maybe some additional insights and information about how the tour is going.
Could I ask a follow-up question that's
Please.
just more logistical, not in terms of the public meeting area, but as commissioners, we're going to be traveling. And have you indicated per diem rates, or can you provide us with, I guess, per diem rates, recommended hotels that we stay at, things like that? So we are sure to follow whatever DOA rules are as part of that. So our travel doesn't really probably begin for overnight till next week, but if we could have some of that information, that would be helpful.
Yes,
Thank
we have a kind of a travel handbook that Valerie put together that will get out to you all, and then hotel recommendations and just some other helpful, useful items. So we should have that to you today or tomorrow. And we can also help arrange or book any of the reservations you need. So we'll work through all that in the next few days.
Yeah, I don't think in summer in Arizona, you don't have to plan quite as early with the lodging. Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Director Schmidt. With that, we'll move to agenda item number 9, discussion and possible action on stock IRC presentation for public use. I don't know if there's any updates from yesterday.
I should have the hopefully final version to you all today. And if you have any edits or suggestions, let me know. But if not, we'll get that on the website so the public can view it.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for your feedback. It's really been a team effort. With that, we will move to agenda item number 11, discussion of future agenda item requests. I think we had a discussion a few minutes ago that I know our staff duly noted. Anything else that any of the commissioners would like to ensure that we add to our agenda?
This is Commissioner York. We talked about evaluating and developing, I think on the timeline was August 3rd for the grid map could start. So do we start the discussion prior to that of where or how does it start, or do we wait till then?
I think Doug needs to answer that question, if you don't mind.
Not at all. So that's when we were planning on presenting options and ideas for how you can do it. We think it'll be straightforward enough that you may be able to decide that same meeting, but there's a little bit of flex time in there as well if you need another meeting to decide. But we're still working. We have the methods that obviously the last 2 commissions used, but we're also looking into kind of new options provided by new technology and kind of auto drawing options of software, so we can include those when we present to you.
Okay, thank you.
I just have a quick follow-up. It's probably may not be appropriate in future agenda, but about our meetings, on whether they'll be live streamed.
The public hearings on the
Yes.
tour? Yes, it absolutely will be.
Thank you. Sorry for that.
Okay, anything else before we move to agenda item number 12, which is announcements? Okay, next meeting date, agenda item number 13. Our listening tour dates are on our website. Other than that, the next official public meeting with the a quorum of commissioners will be next Tuesday, July 27th at 8 a.m. So we look forward to seeing you then. With that, we'll move to agenda item number 14, closing of public comments. Please note, members of the commission may not discuss items that are not specifically identified on the agenda. Therefore, pursuant to ARS 38-431.01H, action taken as a result of public comment will be limited to directing staff to study the matter, responding to any criticism, or scheduling the matter for further consideration and decision at a later date. With that, we move to agenda item number 14, adjournment. I will entertain a motion to adjourn our public meeting.
Commissioner York, I motion to adjourn our public meeting.
Do I have a second?
Commissioner Meal seconds.
I assume no further discussion. We'll do a vote. We're missing Vice Chair Watchman because he's my first one on the list, but we'll move to Commissioner Meal.
Aye.
Commissioner Lerner.
Aye.
Commissioner York.
Aye.
Commissioner Newberg is an aye. With that, we will adjourn. We look forward to meeting so many of you over the upcoming days and reconvening in a public meeting next Tuesday, 8 a.m. Have a great week, everybody.
Thanks, Commissioner Newberg.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.